Welcome back, AP. So let's go ahead and get after it. Let's keep this flip short, right? We only have two little slides to finish up. We're talking about sexual division of labor and early workers' organizations, right? But to finish up where we were talking about, like when we left off in class, we're talking about how there were like two big sectors of industrial working class working areas, right? We had our like cotton textile mill work, right? And then we had our coal mines work, right? We talked about how in a cotton mill, oftentimes like whole families were recruited for actually working, right? The head of the household would usually discuss with the factory owner like different jobs for different pieces of the family. Child labor heavily encouraged during this time period, even by family units themselves. Mothers felt that they could watch their kids while they worked and actually really be able to work alongside of them and also turn those children into small wage earners for the household, right? But then, under pressure from outside sources, all right, particularly that of artisans and skilled craftsmen at the time, the Factories Act of 1833 comes out, right? So children between 9 and 13 were only allowed to work 8-hour days. Under the age of 9, not allowed to work anymore, right? 14 to 18, 12-hour shift. All factories were required to have elementary schools for work under 9. This led to a dramatic decrease in child labor, right? It also led to a decrease in the labor of women as well. And from this, let's lead into our next segment where we're talking about the sexual division of labor by division of labor by gender, right? Now, there are two schools of thought when you're talking about division of labor by gender, all right? Some historians believe that it's the patriarchy that has like held everything down and that like sexist attitudes toward women led into this model of division of labor by gender. There is a second school of thought that believes that the division of labor has pretty much always existed since even hunter-gatherer times, but that it has slowly evolved into different phases of history and then nowadays needs to kind of be eradicated because it's not necessary to divide labor by gender because our labor is now not actually so physically intrusive, right? So if you had to ask me personally, I'm probably in that second school because if you look at the old model before the industrial, that's what we're talking about right now, the old model, labor was kind of divided by gender even in pre-industrial era, right? Because men and women just held different jobs, right? Usually women were spinners, carters, or home workers, and also in charge of child rearing, whereas the men drew plows and did a lot of the heavy lifting in agricultural sectors, right? Well, and when the Industrial Revolution comes along, it evolves a little bit, right? Middle class work, question mark. Did middle class women even work very much at all? No, we talked about that last industrial middle class piece, right? Women in the industrial middle class were discouraged not to work, period, right? They were told that they weren't supposed to work, and men actually sought out families who agreed with this concept to marry those daughters because they believed that their wives were meant to actually be at home, not in politics, and not being behind like a desk or working through these large companies, right? So what about urban working women, though, around 1850? The thing about it, after the Factories Act of 1833, there was also a sharp decline in women working in society, which led to this whole concept of like separate spheres, right? So as the governments begin to become involved in regulating the patterns of work, right? This separate spheres thing kind of evolved in industrial society, right? Again, an evolution of these things, where basically men emerged as the breadwinner, and the woman and women as wife at home and mother, right? Or picking up small side jobs where they could. Now, this whole concept was not necessarily like decided on and, you know, women, you're going to do this, men, you're going to do this. A lot of it had to do from pressure from your government, right? And again, it's just an evolution of this old model, right? It's like the division of labor by gender just took on a new face. Now, some of you are all like, well, wait a minute. What about young unmarried women? They don't have kids. What about widowed women? They have to work. What about women with sick husbands? They have to work. Yes, this is true, right? I'm not saying that all women exited the workforce, right? What I'm saying is that it just changed face when governments began to become involved in labor agreements, right? The thing about it is it also became very unfair, right? So due to this separate spheres concept, because everything has pushback, there's never going to be a government initiative that fixes everything. Go ahead and get that out of your mind, right? A big pushback from this whole thing is that women began to, when they worked, only be able to take on meager earnings, right? Mostly in textile factories, helping run the machines, laundry services, maid services, and wealthy people's homes, right? And a lot of people are like, well, why didn't the women just get out there and work? Well, let's look at that really, really quick. Okay, first and foremost, after the Factories Act, could a woman watch her kids while she worked like she could when factories were recruiting whole families? Not anymore, right? They couldn't actually necessarily do that anymore because children under the age of 9 couldn't even work anymore. So they couldn't actually like hold their child while working like we were talking about today in class, right? And then not to mention the fact too that being a woman or a husband or anything, a parent of any type during this time period required almost like a second shift, right? You didn't have a refrigerator. You had to run to the market every single day, right? To be able to feed your family, you had to go do errands every single day and raise children and make sure they were trying to get educated and things like that. It happens. This is the why did this happen section. There's a multifaceted element of industrial life, okay? And women had a lot of big responsibilities that they inherently, evolutionarily speaking, not evolutionary like scientifically, I mean evolutionary like societal evolution, they kind of took on those responsibilities. And men are going to emerge as this breadwinner, right? And a big portion of it, too, is they began to be restricted from certain types of work, right? For example, the Mines Act of 1842, right? Let me give you a quick story before we get on to the next thing. It's a super short slide, right? The Mines Act of 1842, it outlawed women from working below ground, and all boys under the age of 10 were not allowed to work below ground anymore. A lot of this actually happened from this image I'm about to show you right here. So as you can see looking at this woman, right, she's dragging a cart with a leather strap around her waist through a mine shaft, right? She can't stand up straight. But if you look up here, something that a lot of you are not noticing, middle-class individuals began to take these like journeys into the working sectors of the world, almost like they're going to a zoo exhibit, right? They're going to check on their investments. And something they began to notice is that women were working underground, and a lot of them weren't fully clothed because it was so hot, right? Some women were also working without shirts on and stuff like that, and this horrified the middle class, horrified them that there maybe is nefarious things going on underground, which typically that wasn't even the case, right? And then they also said, well, what about when these women like hit puberty? We might have to deal with like assault of these young girls. And that is very, very true. That is something that you might have to actually deal with. But it turned into this thing where, ironically enough, most of those women were hired by relatives. So it wasn't really something that like women at the time worried about. However, these middle-class people observing all of these things began to actually say, we need to ban women from working underground. These are horrific conditions. Super against being banned from this labor because mines work was right. So early years evolved, right? That's the big thing you need to know. Now, anyway, early labor movements, right? So unions this entire time, there we go. During this entire time period, and some of you are probably still confused as to what a union is, right? Well, what it is it's a group of workers, right, that come together to try and achieve certain standards, right? Now, early on, these things were actually outlawed, right? They were called combination workers, right? So the Combination Act of 1799, as well as many, many old laws regulating craft work, right, they're going to be banned, right? So like unions, just know that the Combination Acts and Parliament's repeal of old laws regulating craft work banned unions for a time, right? So because the Combination Act said no combinations of workers can come together and demand things of their employer, right? So bang, unions take a hit. The Parliament also back in the day repealed old laws in the 1500s that regulated craft work, right? So craft workers had come together and set standards for their work, and they were like, all right, well, only men can enter these guilds, right? We have to regulate how old an apprentice can be, where they're going to work far enough away from us so that they won't compete with our prices, right? Well, Parliament repealed these laws, and a lot of early business entrepreneurs started trying to make certain crafts employing women and children, affecting the price of these products, right? So Parliament's going to repeal those old laws, right? So what's going to end up happening, though, all this stuff gets repealed in 1824, right? Because they weren't really, really enforced, right? And so the earliest unions were organized, performed strikes, and had apprentices, right? And what they were looking for are just eventually going to grow into legitimate unions, and they're going to become politically active, right? We'll talk about unions a little bit more in depth tomorrow, but just so you know, unions were a big deal, all right? Just really out of that whole thing, all you really need is unions emerge, demanding new rights of their work, right? So, for example, this right here is the Amalgamated Society of English Engineers, right? This right here is the Amalgamated Society of English Woodworkers, right? This right here is the Amalgamated Society of Papermakers. They weren't even called unions for quite some time. They were called amalgamated societies, right? Where they would actually come together and begin to demand like different types of standards for their work, right? So we will talk a little bit more about unions tomorrow, kind of describing what they are, because I feel like some of you probably don't understand completely what they are supposed to be, but we'll get into that, and I wanted to keep the flip short, so there you go. Y'all have a great day. See you guys tomorrow. That's all for the Industrial Revolution.